big trade, big trade, big trade, big,
Imbalance support zone.
big,
Imbalance,
Absorption buyers
imbalance
and
resistance
PSH4.
zone. Imbalance
volume
resistance zone.
big trade,
Imbalance
Absorption
resistance
sellers
zone.
and Q.
Imbalance resistance zone.
Absorption sellers and Q.
big trade, big trade, big trade,
Imbalance,
big trade, 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 big
imbalance resistance zone.
Absorption buyers and Q. PSH4.
big trade,
High volume spike.
big trade, big trade,
Absorption buyers and Q.
big trade, big trade,
Imbalance support zone.
Absorption buyers and Q.
big trade, big trade,
Absorption buyers and Q.
big trade, big trade, big trade,
Absorption buyers and Q.
big trade, 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 big
Imbalance support zone.
big trade, big trade,
Imbalance support zone.
big trade,
Absorption
Big
sellers
trade.
and Q.
big trade, big trade,
Imbalance support zone.
big trade, big trade, big trade,
Absorption buyers and Q.
big trade,
Imbalance support zone.
Absorption buyers and Q.
big trade,
Seller sweep and
big
Q.
trade,
Absorption buyers and Q.
Imbalance resistance zone. Imbalance resistance zone.
big trade,
Imbalance support zone.
Absorption buyers and Q.
big trade,
Seller sweep and Q. Absorption buyers and
big
Q.
trade, big trade,
Imbalance support zone. Imbalance resistance zone. Imbalance resistance zone.
Big trade. Big trade. Big trade. Big trade. Big.
Imbalance.
Big trade.
Buyer sweep and
Big
QH
trade.
absorption buyers and Q.
Big trade. Big trade. Big
Absorption
trade.
buyers and Q.
Big trade. Big trade. Big trade. Big trade.
Imbalance support zone.
Big trade.
Imbalance resistance zone. Imbalance
Absorption
resistance
sellers and
zone.
Q.
Imbalance resistance zone.
Big trade.
Imbalance resistance zone.
Big trade. Big trade. Big trade. Big trade. Big trade.
Absorption buyers and Q.
Big.
Imbalance support zone.
Big trade. Big trade.
Imbalance support zone. Imbalance support zone. Imbalance support zone.
Big trade. Big trade. Big trade.
Absorption buyers and Q.
Big trade.
Imbalance support zone. Imbalance support zone. Imbalance support zone.
Big trade.
Imbalance support zone.
Big trade. Big trade.
Imbalance support zone. Imbalance support zone. Imbalance resistance zone.
Big trade. Big trade. Big trade. Big trade. Big trade. Big trade. Big trade.
Absorption
Imbalance
buyers and
support
Q.
zone.
Big.
Imbalance resistance zone.
Big.
Imbalance
Big trade. Big. Big
Absorption
trade.
buyers and Q.
Big trade. Big trade.
Seller sweep and Q.
Big trade.
imbalance support zone. Imbalance
Big trade. Big trade. Big
Buyer
trade.
sweep and Q.
Big trade.
imbalance support zone.
Big trade.
Absorption sellers and Q.
Big trade.
Absorption buyers and Q.
Big trade. Big trade. Big trade. Big trade.
Buyer sweep ES.
Big trade.
Hit the damn likes button. ESH
Big
buyers
trade.
high volume spike.
Imbalance resistance zone.
Absorption sellers and Q.
Big trade. Big trade.
Imbalance
Big trade.
Absorptions buyers ES.
imbalance
ESH4.
support
Hidden
zone.
S.
Big trade. Big trade. Big
Imbalance resistance zone.
big trade.
Imbalance support zone. Imbalance support zone.
Big trade.
Imbalance support zone.
Big trade. Big trade. Big trade. Big trade.
Seller sweep and Q4. Absorption buyers ES. Absorption sellers and
Imbalance
Q.
resistance
Seller
zone.
sweep ES.
Big trade.
Absorption buyers and Q.
Big trade. Big trade.
Absorption buyers and Q.
Big trade. Big trade.
Imbalance.
Big trade. Big trade.
Absorption buyers and Q.
big,
Imbalance support.
big trade. Big,
Absorption
big
buyers
trade.
N4. Buyers NQ4. Buy
Big
volume
trade.
spike.
Big trade.
Absorption buyers
Big.
NQ.
Imbalance support zone.
Big trade. Big trade.
Imbalance support zone.
Big trade.
Absorption buyers NQ.
Imbalance resistance zone.
Big trade. Big trade. Big trade. Big trade.
Imbalance resistance.
Big trade. Big trade. Big trade.
Imbalance resistance zone. Imbalance resistance zone.
Big trade.
Imbalance support zone. Imbalance resistance zone.
Big trade. Big trade. Big trade. Big trade. Big trade. Big trade.
Imbalance support zone. Imbalance support zone. Imbalance support zone.
Big trade.
Imbalance support zone.
Big trade. 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 Big trade.
Imbalance support zone.
Big trade.
Imbalance support zone. Imbalance resistance zone.
Big trade. Big trade.
Imbalance resistance zone.
Big trade. Big trade. Big trade.
Imbalance resistance zone. Imbalance support zone. Imbalance support.
Big
Imbalance resistance.
big trade.
Imbalance support zone. Imbalance resistance zone.
Big trade. Big trade.
Imbalance resistance zone. Imbalance support zone.
Big trade.
Imbalance resistance zone.
big trade, big trade, big trade, big trade,
Imbalance support zone.
big trade, big
Imbalance
trade, big trade, big trade,
Imbalance support zone.
big trade, 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 big trade,
Imbalance support zone.
big trade, 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 big
Imbalance support zone. Imbalance resistance zone.
big trade, big trade, big trade, big trade,
Imbalance support zone.
big trade,
Imbalance resistance zone. Imbalance support zone. Imbalance support zone.
big trade, big trade,
Imbalance support zone.
big
Imbalance resistance zone. Imbalance support zone.
big trade,
Imbalance support zone.
big trade, big trade, big trade,
Imbalance resistance zone. Imbalance support zone.
big tree,
imbalance resist, imbalance,
big tree,
imbalance resistance zone,
big tree, big tree, big tree,
imbalance resistance zone, imbalance resistance zone, imbalance
big tree, big tree,